So our first speaker today is Chris Mooney. Chris is a New York Times best-selling author who comments on the intersection between science and politics. He's a highly regarded public speaker, and he's a science communication trainer who has helped thousands of scientists communicate the importance of science to the public. He is the author of 4 books, including Unscientific American: How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future, which he wrote with co-author Cheryl Kirshenbaum. Chris has been a visiting associate with the Center for Collaborative History at Princeton. He's been a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and a Templeton Cambridge Fellow in Science and Religion. He currently hosts Climate Desk, which is a journalistic collaboration dedicated to exploring the human, environmental, economic, and political impact of changing climate. Chris was born in Arizona. He grew up in New Orleans and received his bachelor's degree in English from Yale University in 1999. And my development office thought that I should actually point out one other important thing about Chris. He has the unique distinction of being named in 2005 by Wired magazine one of the world's 10 sexiest geeks.
He's taken already.
Now, I will leave that up to everybody else's judgment. I'm staying out of that one. Anyway, Chris's talk today is entitled The Psychology Behind the War on Environmental Science.
Get to, but in order to get there, we need to understand some of the reasons why you get things like this. Okay? Why is there so much resistance to environmental science, climate change science in particular, and if we're ever going to get past it, we need to understand some of the root causes. And that's what I want to talk to you about. It's actually a new talk. I did a lot of work, so some of this I haven't presented before, so I hope that you like it. Before getting into it, I want to tell you a little bit more about me, like why should you listen to me about this stuff? What do I have to say, and who the heck am I? So I'm not a scientist, you already heard that. I'm a journalist who writes about science. Basically, I'm a writer. And, you know, growing up, maybe I could have ended up writing about anything at all, because mostly I just wanted to write. But a certain person had a really huge influence on me, making me who I am, pushing me in this direction. You might say that a certain person communicated science to me in a way that was unforgettable, in a way that stuck. And I'm referring to my late grandfather, Gerald Cole, the Arizona State limnologist. I know we have a lot of marine biologists here, so some of you might even have seen his textbook of limnology. That's my grandfather. He was this sort of larger-than-life, irascible scientist character. You might know this kind of person. Utterly rational, completely intolerant of nonsense and superstition, and he brought us up that way. And of course, he thought scientific thinking was a perfect refutation to anything having to do with Ronald Reagan and the young Earth creationists. Was the creationists. And if there's one thing he cared about, it was evolution and interpreting all of life through that lens. It went so far that he even had an invisible friend that he talked to on behalf of us kids. And this friend's name was Chuck, which was short for Chuck Darwin. Okay? So we literally grew up with Darwin. He was right there with us. So I kind of imbibed the scientific worldview at a pretty young age. And I think this is probably what tilted me onto the course of wanting to be the kind of writer who attempts to act as a connector between science, politics, and society, which I think is the broadest definition of what I do. So I don't know if you know, Darwin didn't call it evolution, he called it descent with modification. So I guess you could say that I'm descended with modification from my grandfather. So I became a writer. I wrote about science. And moreover, following this anti-creationist impulse that had seeped into me, I wrote about the maddening and the often dysfunctional disconnect between science and society. And this started out with my 2005 book, my first book. It was a bestseller. It was called The Republican War on Science. And I like to disclose at the beginning that we were not trying to echo the cover image of another popular book that was knocking them dead at around the same time. I'd sold better than mine, I think. And so the argument was that under the last administration, George W. Bush's administration, scientific knowledge itself, and this is now seen as sort of a historical moment now that can be described this way, but I was writing in the moment now. A lot of scientists in government were very unhappy about the way that their knowledge was being treated, restrictions on their ability to speak to the press, scientific reports being edited by political actors, and it was across a wide array of issues ranging from climate change to stem cells to anything having to do with the environment. So there were all these case studies in the book about misuse of science related to endangered species protections, misuse of science related to mercury pollution and how to regulate it, and of course, repeatedly, misuse of science related to climate change. That was the big one then, and it only has gotten bigger since then. So the book came out, and at the center was, I'm a journalist. I'm trying to provide an explanation, like, why is all this going on? Why are scientists so upset with this administration? And so I came up with a kind of story, and it turned out to be the kind of story that journalists always tell. And now it's a story that I think is kind of incomplete and inadequate, but I want to tell you what it is before we can go beyond it. I would say that it is an environmental narrative, not in the sense of clean air, clean water, or any of the research that you do here, but rather an environmental narrative in the sense that the causal factors that I was drawing attention to are, let's call them nurture factors rather than nature factors, okay? This is the political surroundings, the political environment in which things happen, and that's what's influencing the behavior of the political actors. This is the kind of story that journalists always tell, okay? And so in order to tell the story, I had to say, what is modern political conservatism? What are the constituencies that drive it, okay? What do those constituencies feel about science? And so therefore, what are the politicians that they elect or help to get elected feel about science? And then I could say, well, two of the key constituencies are the Christian conservative constituency and the corporate or business constituency. And yeah, they have a bone to pick with science in all these different areas where a lot of the politicization is occurring. Okay, so the Christian conservatives, they don't like evolution, stem cells, anything having to do with sex. Okay, so now we can explain that. And then the corporate interest, this is all the environmental issues. Okay, this is all the fights over pollution, all the fights over climate change. And so voila, this is why you have so many different complaints from scientists about politicization. That was the narrative that I said explained what was going on. But the reason I'm giving this talk, and the reason I've been doing a lot of writing lately on what you might call the psychology of ideology, is that I no longer see the environmental narrative as sufficient. The problem is that it assumes that we're all, when we come to politics, we're all blank slates. We're just driven by self-interest, but our self-interests diverge, and so voila, political conflagrations occur. But to tell it that way really ignores a huge body of research that's been growing for a long time and really getting ahead of steam into the psychology of why people differ politically to begin with. And over time, I increasingly felt that you couldn't really understand what was going on without looking at that research. I began to suspect that a psychological and, frankly, an emotional explanation was needed to go along with the kind of story that I'd already told, to complement it, not to replace it. They both work hand in glove. Now, I'm very aware that this approach can be controversial. Maybe it's no shocker that people don't like to get their political views psychoanalyzed. Everybody thinks they came to their opinions rationally, right? And they think they made a choice, a rational choice, because they thought through it all, and they think that their ideas make sense. But the problem is there's a huge body of research now suggesting that political ideology is almost exactly the opposite of rationality, okay? And to be clear, I am just reporting on that research, okay? So if you don't like what I have to say, don't blame me, blame the scientists. They're the ones who are responsible for what I'm about to tell you. And so let me tell you what first got me into the idea that I needed to think about psychology in order to explain some of the resistance to science. Or frankly, it explains, I think, everything going on in politics in general, but it also explains specific kinds of problems, like science resistance. It was really, I remember exactly what data I encountered that made me think this way. And it's data showing something that I now like to call the smart idiot effect. Okay, this is very important, so pay attention. Now, this was 2008 survey from Pew. And what you've got here is the relationship between your political party, okay, affiliation, your level of education, and your view on whether global warming is happening because of human activity, okay? So we got college grads and non-college grads, and then we've got Republican, Independent, Democrat. So what you get, and this is what blew my mind, what you get is that if you're a Republican, then the more education you have, the less likely you are to accept that humans are causing climate change. The more education, the more resistance to what scientists say, whereas if you're an independent or Democrat, precisely the opposite is the case. Okay, so like, what? What is up with this? All right, it's not the only way of depicting the smart idiot effect. There are lots of studies, and they consistently find the smart idiot effect. Here's a different way of doing it. We just basically visualized some of the data at Mother Jones, and this is from a guy named Dan Kahan at Yale. Just a little brief background, an egalitarian communitarian is a fancy word for a liberal, and a hierarchical individualist is a fancy word for a conservative. Okay? So what he's doing here is how much risk do you think global warming poses to human health or safety or prosperity? And going up, you've got people who think it's very risky versus not risky. And here, he plots it against their score on the scientific literacy test. Okay? And this is amazing. So the more scientifically literate you get, the more the liberals and the conservatives completely polarize. Okay? So the really smart conservatives are the most sure that there's nothing to worry about. The really scientifically literate ones, and then the liberals go in precisely the opposite direction. It's not only climate change on which this occurs. So he showed a very similar pattern for fracking. Okay, how much risk does fracking pose? And again, you get this big, big gulf. So if you're a scientist and you're wedded to the idea that, oh, we got to educate people, we got to teach them more about how the world works so that they will then accept what we know, I mean, this has got to drive you crazy. You're like, what is up with this? Okay? And so this is why a political, just an account on the surface of politics is not really sufficient to explain the kind of dynamics that are behind resistance to science, or frankly, behind many other things. So I felt that we needed something more. We need something psychological, both to explain data like these, and to explain why people resist certain kinds of ideas, and frankly, explain how we act in politics in general. And this is not a new idea, so I want to start off with a quotation as I really get into the subject matter. This is an image for late 1880s opera by Gilbert and Sullivan called Iolanthe. I don't know if anybody is a Gilbert and Sullivan fan, but there is a funny little verse in here where they're basically talking about this idea. And I'm going to get it wrong in the sense of pronunciation, because I can only surmise that English was pronounced differently back then, because it doesn't rhyme anymore, but it must have rhymed. So I'm going to make it rhyme. Nature always does contrive that every boy and every gal that's born into this world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. Okay? So this is this crazy idea that we can tell liberals and conservatives apart as children before they even have what we think of as ideology. There's something much deeper than that. And actually, there's a lot of modern research that suggests that that might very well be true. But we don't like to accept that. We like to think about politics as a blank slate. We like to think, oh, you know, if I'd just been born somewhere else, different parents, different experience, I would have turned out to be a Republican. A lot of research makes you wonder whether that's really true. Now, what does it have to do with the environment? What I want to do for the rest of the talk is unpack no less than 4 different predominantly psychological or emotional factors, non-rational factors, that have emerged in published psychology research that are pretty clearly implicated in resistance to environmental science in particular. Okay? And so I'll be citing studies that show this. And these are the factors, and I think that when you look at them all, you have a pretty complete explanation for the psychology behind this. Number 1, conspiratorial thinking. Okay? Number 2, distrust of science. Number 3, the need for closure, the need to avoid cognitive dissonance. And number 4, something that we're going to call individualism. And I will unpack that a little bit more at the end, because I think it's actually the single biggest factor. But let's start with conspiratorial thinking. So here's something that completely amazed me when I first heard it. Did you know that people who think that the moon landings are a hoax, that they were staged by Hollywood, or people who think that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone, you know, there was another shooter on the grassy knoll, these people are more likely to deny the science of climate change. these people are also more likely to deny that HIV causes AIDS. And that's the finding from this study by Stephen Lewandowski in Psychological Science. What he, in effect, showed is that there's this surprising element of science rejection that appeals to people who are conspiratorial in their mindset. And this part is not even left-right ideological, okay? It's just conspiratorial. The paper also showed that conspiracy beliefs travel together. So as Lewandowski told me, I interviewed him for a podcast that I used to do. He said if a person believes in one conspiracy, they're likely to believe in others as well. There's a statistical association between the beliefs. So if you think MI5 killed Princess Diana, you probably also think that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act by himself, and you probably also are more likely to not accept climate science. And then there's research explaining why people tend to be conspiratorial. There are distinct personality traits or dispositional factors. They include, you will not be surprised to learn, paranoia, but also a sense of being disgruntled or being unhappy with how the world is treating you. So is it fair to say that the denial of climate science, which is one principal part of environmental science, is conspiratorial? Well, this is the cover of a book by a conservative senator who doesn't accept climate science. It's called The Greatest Hoax: How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. So it's kind of right there. And the more you think about it, the more you have to believe a little bit in conspiracies in order to think that global warming isn't true. Because what you have to believe is that a global network of scientists are all acting to pull the wool over your eyes. And they got to be coordinated in some sense, because how could they all just independently come to make this thing up, right? So this is getting to be a conspiracy. So I want to tell you how the story of the conspiracy theory paper that I just showed you turned out, because it's absolutely, completely amazing, right? So the people who he's calling conspiracy theorists really don't like being called conspiracy theorists. So what do? After the paper comes out, they're very angry about the study, and they start attacking it. So how do they attack it? Conspiracy theories. So they say the research was made up, that it was fabricated. They allege that, because Stephen Lewandowski from Australia, they say that the Australian government was involved. They say the Australian Broadcasting Corporation was involved, that it was this big cabal to call them conspiracy theorists. Okay, funny stuff. In the paper, Lewandowski himself admitted that while he had shown statistically that conspiratorial thinking was a component of science denial, including climate science denial, it wasn't the biggest factor. It was a factor not tied to ideology that seemed to explain what you might say part of the variance or part of the phenomenon. It isn't the biggest factor. It's just one. As I said, the biggest factor I think is the one we'll talk about at the end, individualism. Okay, but let's look at some more of the contributing factors. Let's look at distrust. And I think that this one is really, really big and important and often overlooked. So here's some data from 2012. And this guy, Gordon Gauchat's a sociologist. He was actually setting out to test whether the thesis of my book, The Republican War on Science, was true. And he decided that it was, because what he did was he looked at data from the General Social Survey, which is this really big social science instrument. They asked people the same question year after year after year. And one of the questions that they ask is, how much do you trust the leaders of various institutions in society? Okay, so you've got how much do you trust Congress, how much do you trust the media, how much do you trust the military, how much do you trust doctors, how much do you trust scientists? And for some reason, nobody had bothered to think, oh, let's break out the political differences on this, right? But he just said, how much do you trust scientists? And then let's look at it by conservative, liberal, moderate. And so what he shows, the conservatives are the red, and their level of trust just marches down and down and down over a long period going all the way back to 1974. So he says, yes, Mooney's right. His thesis is validated. And I'm like, score. I'm very, very happy that you did this. But it's not just science in general. We know that political conservatives have lost trust in environmental science in particular. So listen up, because this is what's most important to all of you doing research on this. So at Dartmouth, there's a sociologist named Lawrence Hamilton. And he actually asked a survey question in 2011. What he asked was, would you say that you trust, don't trust, or are unsure about scientists as a source of information on environmental issues? And he got a big partisan difference in responses, okay? So if you're a Democrat, how much do you think, what percent am I going to put up there? How much do you think you trust environmental scientists? So the 67% said trust, 6% said don't trust, and then the rest are in some sort of don't know area. Okay? If you're a Republican, what do you say? 42 trust, 22% distrust. Okay, so I think this adds up to a really big difference, and it seems to be particularly aimed at environmental science. Okay? So where is this coming from? And there's a new paper just out in Public Understanding of Science, which is a journal, that points the finger at one place, actually points the finger at both Rush Limbaugh and at Fox News. And what they say is that we've already known that if you watch a lot of Fox, your likelihood of not accepting the science of climate change goes up. There's a lot of studies on that. But what they show is that your distrust of scientists also goes up. And then they posit, using some fancy statistics that I can't explain, that that's one of the causal reasons that you don't believe climate science anymore. And they explain how the lack of trust actually works to undermine your belief in science. They say that trust is a shortcut. Trust is a heuristic, is the term, but what it basically means is some device that lets you make up your mind super quickly about what you think about something. Okay, so that you don't actually have to know a lot about the science. If you don't trust the researchers, then you can quickly discard what it is that they say. And so that, they think, is the mechanism by which trust is contributing to lack of belief. I mean, I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense. Now, these media outlets that do regularly cast doubt on environmental research and climate research in particular, they are not as old as the data that I showed you going back to 1974, showing that the decline in trust started then. So there's no way that they could be a complete explanation for what's going on. I think that they are very significant. So what else is going on? And here's my theory. I think that political conservatives today know, and let's give them a lot of credit, they are 100% right about this. They know that academia is a big liberal haven, all right? And they know that science is too, and they are correct. American Association for the Advancement of Science members are only 6% Republican, okay? College professors, 14% Republican. Neil Gross is a sociologist of higher education. He puts it like this: more so than ever before, the highly educated comprise a key constituency for American liberalism and the Democratic Party, one that may have surpassed a crucial threshold level in size. So I think that if you're a conservative, you basically grow up knowing this, and you learn that all these academics and all these scientists, they're consistently aligned against you on all of these different issues. So I think the relationship is a lot like the relationship with Hollywood. They know that it's real liberal, all right? They know that every time there's going to be a movie, it's going to have feel-good liberal messages to it. And I think they feel very similarly about the scientific community, and I think that that's one of the key things that engenders distrust. It's liberal land, we don't buy it. Okay. The need for closure, the psychology of closure. So this is the stuff that I honestly think everyone in America should know in order to really understand politics. I'm surprised that we don't, that more people don't know. So you might not be aware, but a huge body of research shows that liberals and conservatives have different personalities. And yeah, maybe it's not that shocking. And I'm going to demonstrate this in the simplest way that I know how to do. What you're looking at here is a study, a big study by Yale political scientists looking at some 12,000 people. And what they're doing is they're looking at the big 5 personality traits: conscientiousness, openness, agreeableness, stability, and extroversion. I'll explain more about them. They also look at level of income and level of education, and they're looking at which ones predict a liberal politics, which puts you in the blue range, and which ones predict a conservative politics, puts you in the red range. And then there's 3 columns for each one, because there's overall liberal conservative, but then there's your economic liberal conservative and your social liberal conservative, and sometimes those don't go together, and other times they do. Okay? So what it shows is that level of income clearly strongly predicts economic conservatism. No big shock there, right? We knew that. And higher education predicts overall liberalism. This is what we just saw, right? It also predicts social liberalism very strongly in particular. And these are the sociological factors that we always acknowledge. Everybody kind of knows that this stuff is true. But it turns out that these personality factors which are partly inherited, are sometimes predicting just as much difference as the sociological factors. And so let's look at them in particular. Conscientiousness, this is wanting order and stability in your life. People who drive to work the same way, keep a really neat office, predicts all kinds of conservatism, okay? Openness, which is I want to try out new things, I want to have new experiences, I want to try this and this and this, new restaurants, I want to listen to different music, I want to go to a lot of countries. I like thrills. Liberalism predicts all kinds of liberalism. There's more of a split on agreeableness, which is about your empathy and your politeness. Stability, this is not all good news for liberals, they're neurotic, okay? And it looks like there's a little bit of favor for conservatives in extroversion. Everybody knows what extroversion is, right? Some studies don't show the extroversion difference. Okay, so politics is personality. And how does this play into the battle over environmental science and science in general? Well, I think that a key factor, okay, so this is what leads to liberalism versus conservatism, openness in education, money, and structure. But also the lack of openness, not wanting to try new experiences, new things. And basically, the opposite of open is closed. All right, so what does this mean? I want to unpack this personality trait a little bit more. These are some slogans that go along with the open personality. This explains why liberals love their Mac computers, okay, and they're willing to spend way too much for them. Okay, so openness is all about wanting change, needing change, but it also means intellectual flexibility. It means being okay with uncertainty, being okay with ambiguity. It means not only being okay with them, but you might want these things. You might want new sensations. There's something called sensation seeking. You might want novelty. You might want to experience difference. And I would postulate that these are strong characteristics of scientists too, and that's why the scientific community is psychologically liberal. Interestingly, this also suggests that across time periods and across eras, there's this exploratory side to human nature, which we call liberal. It's about trying out new things, and it leads to broadly liberal tendencies in politics, and it's friendly to change, which is probably the biggest definition of liberal that there is, and conservatism is the opposite. It also exists across history. It's aversive to change and aversive to new things, and it's friendly to stability and structure and certainty. So these are kind of a yin and yang, and a fundamental part of who humans are. So no matter how much you change the political system, no matter how much you change the culture, you still see a left and right emerge over time. And of course, it goes all the way back to the French Revolution, when left and right were first defined based upon where you sat in one of the many assemblies that they tried to put together as things burned down. And it turns out that on the right were the people who wanted to support the ancien regime, the conservatives that didn't want change, and on the left were the revolutionaries, right? So this happens again and again. I think that it explains a lot. Let's talk about what it might mean for science in particular. Very closely related to the personality construct of openness is this trait called having a need for cognitive closure. And openness is inversely related to having a lot of need for closure. And need for closure is you want a definitive answer to something so that you can basically stop thinking about it. Okay, stop worrying about it, stop having ambiguity, and finally have certainty. I think it's the colloquial definition of closure, basically. And we all need closure about certain things in our lives at certain times because certain things stress us out, okay? And so we have it episodically, but some people just have it more across the board about everything, and some people have it less about everything, and they're fine with being loosey-goosey and like whatever, okay? I don't need answers, it's cool. So if you have a high need for closure, then what Arie Kruglanski, he's the guy who basically pioneered and tested this construct over many studies, what he says you do is you engage in a behavior called seizing and freezing. And seizing and freezing means you find some evidence that supports what you believe so that and then you don't want to change. Like you fix on that evidence and you stay there and you don't want any more evidence or different information. And in fact, if someone fights the evidence, challenge it, then you fight back and defend the evidence because it gave you closure. All right? There is research suggesting that anti-evolutionists and basically religiosity in general, this is associated with more need for closure. We know that on global warming, members of the Tea Party, not only are they the most likely to deny global warming, but they say they don't need any more information about the issue. They're very sure that they are right. Now, it stands to reason that these kinds of traits, divergence on this trait, is going to play itself out through all kinds of everyday reasoning behavior, all kinds of political behavior. There's not that much research tying it to actually different reasoning patterns, but there is something really interesting that just came out. And this is by Jay Van Bavel and his colleagues at NYU. And they were trying to test liberal-conservative differences in trying to avoid cognitive dissonance. Everybody know what that is? Cognitive dissonance is the unpleasant sensation of having ideas in your head that conflict. Okay, we don't like that, so we find some way to make them fit together, or else we find some way to not deal with the dissonance anymore. And so the experiment was, let's put people in a situation where they experience dissonance and see how they do, or see if they're willing to do it. So they said, let's see if liberals, it might have been Democrats, let's see if the people on the left will write an essay in favor of George W. Bush. Okay? And let's see if people on the right will write an essay in favor of Barack Obama, talking about all the good things about them. And they had to make it voluntary to see if people would go along and accept the dissonance. Okay, so what do you think the answer to this equation is? What percent of Democrats were willing to write the pro-Bush essay? Huh? It's a percentage. So the answer was 28%. Okay, so it's not like they're all really open-minded about this. Right? A lot of them don't like Bush, and they were not willing to do this. Like, this is a waste of my time. What, are you kidding me? But how many Republicans were willing to write the essay about all the great things about Barack Obama? So that's what they reported in Public Library of Science in this paper. I don't know. I mean, I think that those numbers might actually say something about a lot about our politics right now. So it's not that like one side's less, unbiased and one side's biased. That's not true. Both sides are biased, but they might not be equally biased. One side might be much more allied to its team and its beliefs than the other side. There's no reason why that wouldn't be the case. In fact, there's a lot of evidence suggesting it might very well be the case. Okay. So one last thing, individualism. And this is really big and really important. So I'm calling it individualism, but you'll know it best because it's associated with libertarianism. Individualism is a deep-seated, I'll call it a feeling more than a philosophy because it's very emotional, like all of politics is. It's a feeling about how society ought to be structured. And the people who embrace it tend to be libertarian. But the idea is that the best society is one in which we all get ahead in the world or fall behind the world based upon our own merits. Okay? So if you fail, you deserved it. And that is a fair outcome. And what's unfair is the government getting involved and tipping the scales and playing favorites. Okay, that's basically what I mean by individualism, and that is the core belief of libertarianism. And like other ideologies, like liberalism and like conservatism, libertarianism too has a psychology that goes with it. Unlike other ideologies, libertarianism, and I find this really fascinating, it also has a strong gender bent to it. Okay, so according to recent Pew data, libertarians are 67% male, but according to another study I'm going to show you in a second, they were 80% male. So I've never seen a study that didn't suggest that they're mostly male. But what does it mean to be a libertarian? And this is, I think, some of the most important data that we can look at for understanding where there might be solutions for common ground. Okay, so this is this big study about all the psychological traits of libertarians and compares them to liberals and conservatives and all these traits. I'm going to have to explain a little bit. But what this is the study of our moral foundations by Jonathan Haidt. He's pretty, people might have seen him because he's sort of the most popular person who talks about the psychology of ideology, and his colleagues. And what he finds is that underlying our political views are different sets of moral emotions. So think about situations that make us feel moral. It turns out that there's a lot of left-right differences in terms of how strong your moral reaction is to these sort of situations. So situations where someone is experiencing harm, okay, liberals tend to have the strongest sensitivity to harm. It's not that conservatives, so liberals are white, conservatives are solid, and libertarians are striped. So liberals have the strongest emotions, when they see that happening. They also have the strongest emotions around fairness and equality. And again, it's not like conservatives and libertarians don't feel this, but they don't feel it as strongly. Conservatives have got these three things that liberals completely don't understand, right? Which is in-group, so I'm loyal to the people like me, but not loyal to the people who aren't like me. Authority, so I respect people in charge. Liberals are like, I hate authority. Right. Purity,
which is like literally I feel grossed out by things that are yucky, including many sexual things that I find yucky. Okay? And then, no, this is what it means. This is what it is. They feel revulsion in a different way. Okay? And then there's this strong emotion around liberty. And this is where the libertarians come in. And lifestyle liberty, stay out of my bedroom. Okay? Liberals and libertarians both feel that really strongly. Okay? Let me do whatever I want. But libertarians and conservatives have this really strong emotion that's much stronger than liberals, and this is what allies them to each other, on economic liberty, which is keep the government out of my economy. Not keep the government out of my bedroom. Keep it out of my economy. And all of this stuff is deeply emotional. So in other words, you feel before you think. You encounter a situation that triggers one of these emotions, and then your reasoning, your arguments are all impelled by the feeling. That's the theory of moral foundations. That's how it's supposed to work. So this, it turns out that this economic liberty emotion and this economic liberty moral foundation is, I think, the leading cause of the resistance to environmental science because of the association that is made by libertarians between the science and the government doing some kind of regulatory action, which they find morally offensive. Okay, and that's why climate change has gotten so polarized, is this belief that in order to do anything, that if the science is true, it must mean that there's going to have to be some kind of comprehensive regulatory action on carbon. Okay, and all the studies show that this is one of the key factors, and I think based on everything I've seen, probably the number one factor. Okay, so I've shown you a number of psychological and emotional reasons. All this is in published research that I would say probably underlie a lot of the resistance to environmental research. You'll notice that nowhere have I done what journalists usually do, which is to like point to big companies and say, they're the reason, okay? They're funding all this environmental science denial, and that's why people believe it. It's all about follow the money, follow the money. I know my fellow journalists, they love to do this, but it's way too simplistic. It's not how it works. There have been all these attacks from the left on the Koch brothers, okay? Maybe you've read this, okay? Because they seem to be really against climate change, right? And they have lots of money. But you know what? They're also libertarians, okay? So, I mean, it isn't just simply follow the money, it's follow the psychology, all right? Follow what they care about. So claiming and only telling this story at the surface of politics doesn't really get at what is going on. You need to understand the phenomenon in its human dimensions. So what should you do with this information? And now let's pivot towards getting somewhere. What can you do? It should change your behavior. It should change how you approach the act of persuading people with evidence and knowledge. First of all, you should know that evidence and knowledge are not enough because all of this stuff, as we've seen, is deeply emotional. But first of all, in my opinion, if you want to convince somebody about environmental science, or if you want to communicate, you have a lot of choices, and based upon everything I've said, probably the last thing you should do is run out and talk to a male libertarian, okay? There's probably doors that are more open, okay? And so think about that first. In fact, probably the most important takeaway is that the resistance is coming from a particular set of people who have a particular set of psychological traits and particular set of dispositions, but that's not all people. There's a vastness of people who have all kinds of different views, and so you need to be thinking about which ones you're reaching. This is the Yale and George Mason research that is on, they call it the 6 Americas of global warming. They've divided the whole national audience into 6 segments. They give them names, and it really does actually run a little from left to right. It's the alarm to the liberals, environmentalists who know a lot about the issue and are totally scared, and they think that methane's going to blow up in the Arctic and the world's going to become Venus, okay? Well, that's not really what they think, but that might be the most extreme. And then it goes all the way to the people who don't believe the science at all. But you'll notice that the biggest circles are the concerned, the cautious, the disengaged, and these are the people that are most malleable. They know the least, okay? And they don't have a big stake and a big commitment in the way that the dismissive really have. A lot of them are kind of weather vanes, and they swing around their views based upon whether it's weird outside, whether the weather's changing. Okay, so you can make so much more headway with some of these audiences than you can make with the doubtful and the dismissive. So you ought to be targeting them different. That's the first implication. But then if we go back to this data, there's really some more lessons, because what I didn't tell you is that these guys have also shown, they actually ran some data for me, that environmental concern is most strongly correlated with this harm sentiment, okay? And that's also one of the ones where liberals are the highest. So what it means is if you want to connect with anybody other than liberals, right, you have all these different ways that are almost never used to connect by appealing to different moral emotions. And there's actually published research, interestingly, showing that this one really works for conservatives. If you want to make them care about the environment, give them a feeling of disgust about environmental degradation. Talk about it in terms of defilement. Okay? Talk about how repulsive pollution is. And you might open a door. So what this does is it broadens the menu of the different kinds of communication that can be done. So there's much more that could be unpacked with all this evidence, but that's one of the roads that is rarely tried that the evidence suggests ought to work. So let me conclude here. There'll probably be many questions. But I want to leave you with a few words of eternal wisdom from a profound philosopher, Yoda. Yoda said, "You must unlearn what you have learned." And when it comes to understanding why you get all this resistance to science, or environmental science in particular, or understanding how to reach people who disagree with you, that is exactly what we must do. Well, on the libertarian one, that's the thing, is that on liberals and conservatives, they're basically roughly gender equal. But the reason that we have a gender gap in politics, I think, is largely the libertarian part of the conservative movement, where there really is a gender difference. Is that what you meant, or did you mean the other traits?
Well, reading some of Haidt's work, you get the sense that the way he plots it out is that empathy is, or something you would call empathy, is very important to
Yes.
Democrats, and it's
to
not
women, yes.
unimportant to Republicans, but then they have all this other stuff that sort of competes with it.
Right. I mean, so I would associate empathy most of all with the harm, moral foundation, okay? And when you go to personality traits, empathy is going to be found under the agreeableness trait, which I showed, but I'm trying to find out where it is. And so, yeah, I actually looked this up because someone was challenging me when I hinted that empathy is not completely equally distributed across the genders. No, it's not. I mean, and so it is, women score higher in empathy. It doesn't mean that men don't have it. Some men can score very high, but if you take the distribution, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, this has been one. I wish I had a copy of the whole thing. I didn't take any notes, but the one thing you somehow left out, although you hinted at it, and that's the role of poverty in all of this. Poverty creates tremendous insecurity, and therefore people look for simplistic. I sort of forget how I would have put it in there, but poverty has an awful lot to do with a lot of these values.
Well, all kinds of situations create instability. I would say that from 9/11 to the economic collapse, you had a lot of different kinds of things that created huge uncertainty and instability. And one of the parts of the psychology of ideology theory is that in periods of instability, people swing to the right politically because they want certainty. They want easy answers, and they don't want to mess around. They want somebody to make it all okay. I think that poverty is not necessarily unique. Basically, you're talking about situations of stress, where everything's unclear, and people want closure and they want answers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like you to talk a little bit more about scientists and trust of scientists. Amy Harmon, one of your colleagues at New York Times, has written series of articles and gave a great talk about how the scientists are not really good at engaging the public, and they need to get out there and explain things to people. So I was wondering, what's your view on that, especially now that there's books by Rebecca Skloot about the HeLa cells and people being misled by scientists. So what do they need to do to regain the trust of the public?
Well, I mean, I'm big pro science engagement, and I teach scientists how to do it. I think that they need to be very aware of all of these kinds of things. I think they're not aware enough of all the different ways that it can backfire, and all of the assumptions that people who don't agree with you can be bringing to the table that you might be completely unaware of, down to something like, you know, if you have a beard, okay, they might associate you with liberalism. So, I mean, like, there's all these quick things going on that really can make a difference. And they're very subtle. So I would say that scientists should engage. They should be familiar with this research. They should be familiar with the reasons that there's a perceived lack of trust. And I think that on that, I think it's clearly the belief on the right, which is not inaccurate, that scientists tend to be liberal. And so they need to go in kind of aware. But that's only, remember, that's only if they're going into the room where it's most difficult to persuade anybody. There's a lot of different audiences where the distrust is not going to be so high. And so they need to think also about what kinds of efforts they're going to make and where they think that it's going to have the real impact. I mean, again, look, the distrust is actually not the same in all the political groups. It's actually, it's a left-right thing, according to this data. So you got to be super aware of it if that's your audience. If that's not your audience, it might not be as much of a thing. Okay? But if that is your audience, then they might be good. Then they might immediately be thinking it's a liberal scientist. So you're going to have to do all of these things to find common ground that are going to be super hard. And if you say, and most importantly, if you say anything controversial before you have disarmed everybody's emotionality completely, then you're really stepping into a difficult situation. Yes? Oh. Okay. Okay.
Would you comment on the role, or the power of the press, let's say, dare I say, the Koch brothers, and influencing people of both sides in terms of their point of view, the bought press in particular?
Well, I mean, I think that the evidence is clear that if you take Fox, it clearly creates big distrust of environmental science, and it makes people doubt climate change. Other media outlets apparently have the opposite effect. They make people trust scientists more because they treat them as credible. So the press has a huge impact because it's the main source in the environment, the political environment, that is feeding information.
Isn't it marketing of a sort?
Yeah, I mean, these are money-making entities, and they're not there for just to edify us. They're there to make sure that we pay attention. I'm not sure what you mean about the Koch brothers and the press.
Because they have a strong influence on the things like tobacco and climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I see the main conservative influencers as kind of, insofar as they support ideas, like they might, you know, a lot of conservatives who are wealthy support think tanks, and what those think tanks do is they put out a variety of information and analysis that's from a conservative perspective, and then that stuff is championed by the conservative press and treated neutrally by all the rest of the press. And so I think that's one of the key mechanisms of influence. Yeah.
This graph, I mean, there's something very interesting about it. Everybody starts out at the same place in 1974.
Yeah.
The liberals remain flat, and the conservatives and moderates go down. What's going on there? What's happening in that period?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Basically, the way he explains it, and I don't remember what he says about early in the period, but he says that there's, you know, several breakpoints where science became more politicized, and the George W. Bush administration is one of them. But he also points to, I think he pointed to Reagan as being one of them. So I think that there's a couple political breakpoints. I tend to think that in the 80s, you have Star Wars. basically, in the first book, I talked about some of the history of political science fights. And Star Wars is one that was really big, and it was one in which all these academics signed petitions attacking Ronald Reagan's big missile defense initiative, and so you really had a good reason for conservatives to distrust academics. So I think that there's a long history of those fights. But why it dips so early and why also the moderates go way down, I don't have, and that's a question that's often asked by people who see this data. And in the paper, there's no real good explanation for the moderates dipping in this way.
But it clearly is
Yeah.
pointing to the fact that there's an environmental influence, there's
Oh, yeah.
sort of a social influence on this. And he actually suggests that, at least with trusted scientists, there are conditions where generally can be equal and high across all sorts of fields.
Yeah. Well, that's later. I mean, so it's important to understand that historically, you're coming prior to this is a period where you have Eisenhower and Kennedy, where basically there was a lot of consensus in politics about the role of science and not much partisanship. So everybody thought that science was basically rah-rah, this is how we maintain our competitiveness and win the Cold War. And so there was a lot of unification about that, and things start to fall apart. I mean, Nixon actually, didn't Nixon fire his science advisors? I should know because I wrote the book, but I haven't checked the fact in a while. I mean, so Nixon actually fired his science advisors, if I'm remembering correctly. So there was a lot of politicization starting there, I think. Yeah.
I would just suggest a hypothesis for those dips that you don't really have anything before 74, but that's the 70s, and they're, before that was the 60s.
Yeah, that'll do it.
And so there was a huge kind of openness that was happening there, and dissemination of information. The Vietnam War was on TV, and so I might suggest that some of that's a backlash that's happening. I mean, the people who are personalities tend to not want to know what's going on because it rubs them the wrong way and goes against. So some of that may just be that.
It's true. All the environmental issues were big in the 70s. So maybe that was a polarization. I mean, this is I don't know, you want to assign some research? Anybody got a graduate student that we can get to do this? I don't know, but I suspect that there's a lot of things going on. But Nixon, I think, actually was, there were a lot of science politicization, and I refer you to the Republican War on Science. It has like 4 pages on it, but I wrote it 7 years ago, so I don't remember all the details.
Yeah, it is always useful to ask what is the relationship between displays like this and the real circumstances of the majority of the people. In the same period that we are looking at, there is a significant divergence in the incomes policy of the United States. After 25 years of growth in the area of Eisenhower and Kennedy, based non-trivially on the science regime of Vannevar Bush, we have flat incomes for working class people, women entering work and still holding down domestic labor, whereas the income distribution to the top decile and even the top 1% goes through the roof. I think that's one of the important background factors in people's perceptions of their life circumstances and the role of science in society.
I don't disagree. I mean, all I will say, I mean, I could give you one more thing, okay? I mean, what about the increasing involvement of Christian conservatives in politics, which wasn't really big, and it really came on strong, and Ronald Reagan's election is sort of the year when it went politically mainstream, and the Southern Democrats became Republicans. It's one of the biggest things. So I don't think I don't think we know all the causes. So.
Yes, when you look at these data,
Everybody loves
and
these
you
data.
look at the red line,
Yeah.
what they're plotting there is how far to the right it goes over these years. That is, the people in the red line in 2007 and 8 would not consider the people in 1978 conservatives.
Yes, that changed too.
I mean, so
the
you have-
definition,
this is
the
a
whole
real
the
variance.
parties changed a lot. Yeah. And so I mean, you didn't have partisan fights over science in the same way It's certainly not under Eisenhower and Kennedy. I mean, there might have been a couple things, but the kinds of fights that we have now, I mean, it's really not in the record. I went back and looked. There was just so much more consensus, but it was a consensus in America in general. So science just fell into the maw of politics just like everything else did.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed your talk, but I'm puzzled by one thing. And that is, and I might have been wrong in understanding you. I'm Dutch, by the way. So strong European roots in sustainability and not so familiar with the American discourse. You seem to make an assumption that there is a direct line between point of view and the performance of pro-environmental behavior. And that resistance to point of view directly leads to a resistance to pro-environmental behavior. And I'm not sure that the data on that are actually in Europe consistent. Can you say a little bit about that from your understanding?
Well, there's a lot of things in Europe that are really different than how things play out here. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that it's different in Europe in any number of ways. I'm not sure what you mean beyond that. I mean, certainly the whole, we're much more individualistic, you know, the individualism strain is stronger here. I don't know all the reasons. That's a big question that I can't fully answer. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which point of view?
The point of view that environmental scientists can be trusted, that there is no conspiracy or very little conspiracy in the thinking. The 4 factors that you identified, where those factors would be limited or absent or oscillating or whatever, would that, because I imagine that what's at stake is pro-environmental decision-making and behavior, not
And
whether or
acceptance of
not people
environmental
believe
science.
certain things.
But if you, I mean, in another country, and I'm just not super familiar with how environmental debates play out in other countries, but in another country, if you have the media framing the issue differently, describing the sides differently, then, you know, all the moral emotions can play out differently because of the context.
Okay.
And so, I mean,
Thank you.
and so it's because, I mean, just imagine counterfactual, in which for some reason, no one in the media or of influence had ever said to conservatives that the science of global warming would lead to government regulation. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but just, I mean, there probably would not have been any resistance. But it's because it has been framed so much as government takes over and destroys the economy by regulating that the resistance got so high. You know, if the whole dialogue had been different somehow, then the emotional buttons wouldn't have been pushed, and you could imagine much less polarization. Now, you know, I just think about England. I mean, the media is so different, you know, with the BBC dominating everything versus our Fox, CNN, MSNBC. I mean, it's so different. And the norms of journalism are so different. I mean, a lot of things happen. People get primed to behave in very different ways. So, yeah. All right.